The guard's hand was already moving toward her when the king stood up. No word, no warning. Kael Stormveil simply rose, and 30 people at a feast table forgot how to breathe. He placed himself between the girl with the wine-stained hands and the man with the order, and he stood there the way mountains stand, without explanation, without apology, without any indication that he intended to move. She was no one, a servant, a woman who had spent 703 days making herself invisible in a castle that was never supposed to be her prison. He was the most powerful alpha in Carpathia. He had no reason to protect her. And yet, there he was. The well rope burned through Elara's palms the same way it had for 703 mornings. She did not think about the burning. She counted instead, the rough fibers passing through her grip, the way the bucket dropped into darkness below, the faint splash that meant water was still there, still cold, still real. 703. She had started counting the morning after the night the world cracked open at its seam, and rearranged itself into something she no longer recognized. The night Dorian had stood in the doorway of her chamber with his hands at his sides, and his face already composed into the shape of a verdict delivered, and told her that she was not what he needed, that she was not what he needed, that she was not what he needed, that she was not what he required, that she could remain in Veldrath. The counting had kept her honest. It reminded her that time was moving, even when everything else felt arrested in the amber of that single night. The courtyard of Veldrath was dark at this hour. The castle rose behind her, Romanesque arches cutting black against a sky that had not yet decided between night and morning, the kind of pale grey that existed only in deep winter, when the sun seemed to reconsider rising at all. Her breath came in small clouds. The stone flags beneath her feet were slicked with frost. She could feel through the thin leather of her boots. She hauled the bucket up, hand over hand, arms long since accustomed to the weight. Her right hand bore the old callus from the rope now, a ridge of hardened skin along the heel of the palm that had not been there before. She had been a different person when those hands were soft. A sound, quiet, deliberate, to her left. Elara did not startle. She had learned, somewhere in the first 100 days, that startling drew attention, and attention in Veldrath's lower corridors was rarely kindness arriving. But it was only Marin. The older woman appeared from the shadow of the kitchen arch, moving with the unhurried quiet of someone who had learned decades ago that silence was a form of armor. She set something on the edge of the stone coping beside the bucket, without speaking, a small round of bread, still faintly warm, and a square of dry linen. Then she was already turning back toward the kitchen, her dark skirts whispering against the frost, but not before her hand rested, just for a moment, on Elara's forearm. One brief pressure. Nothing said. Everything meant. Elara looked at the bread for a moment. Then she picked it up and ate it standing at the well, because that was the kind of life this was. Small mercies received standing up, without ceremony, in the cold before the world woke to witness either the mercy or the one receiving it. She folded the linen and tucked it into her apron with her right hand. The bread was dense, seeded, the kind that sat in the stomach and stayed. She was grateful for it in the way she had learned to be grateful for everything, quietly, without expecting it to come again. She was on her third trip across the courtyard, pile of linen balanced on her hip, when she heard them. Dorian's voice first, low, measured, the particular register he used when he was performing calm for an audience. Then Isolde's footsteps, sharper than his, heeled shoes clicking a precise rhythm against stone. Elara kept walking. She had become very good at becoming unremarkable. Elara. The voice stopped her not because it commanded, but because of its texture, smooth as river silk, with an edge beneath that you only found if you were already bleeding. Isolde de Van had never raised her voice in Elara's presence. She had never needed to. Elara turned. Not quickly. She took the time it took. Dorian had stopped a few yards away. He was looking at her the way he sometimes did, not with contempt, which she could have navigated, but with something she had taken months to name. Recognition laced with dread, the expression of a man who has thrown something precious into a river and now watches it floating back toward him on the current. Isolde had already moved past him. She stopped an arm's length from Elara, her fur-trimmed cloak impossibly clean for an hour when frost still clung to every surface. Her face was composed in the particular way of expensive things, every angle deliberate, every expression rehearsed so thoroughly it had calcified into something that resembled naturalness. "I hear the royal party arrives today," Isolde said. Her voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. "I want to be certain we understand each other. If you have any thought of drawing the king's eye, any thought at all, remember that you have no one in this castle who would confirm you are anything other than what you appear to be, least of all confirm that you still carry a war." The last sentence arrived lightly, as though it were a simple observation, and landed the way simple observations sometimes do when they contain the weight of a long campaign. The morning held its breath. Elara looked at a point just past Isolde's left shoulder. The sky there was lightening, barely, a bruised edge of color beginning at the tree line across the river. "I don't need anyone to confirm what I am," she said. She kept her voice level, unhurried, the way she kept everything these days. "I already know." A pause. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Long enough that Elara could feel Isolde searching for the architecture of a reply and finding the ground unexpectedly uneven beneath it. Then the footsteps resumed, past her and away, and Dorian followed without looking back. Elara stood still until the sound of them had gone entirely. Then she hitched the linen heir on her right hip and kept walking. By midday, the upper courtyard was alive with the sounds of an arriving entourage. Horses, metal, voices in languages she recognized, and some she did not, the particular ordered chaos of a traveling court reassembling itself after weeks on winter roads. Elara had been assigned to the East Laundry Yard and had no business near the gates. She was crossing the inner courtyard with her third load of the afternoon when her foot caught a gap between the frost-heaved flagstones. She went down hard. The linens went everywhere, clean linens, which meant she would have to carry them all the way back, which meant Maren would cover for her absence, which meant Elara owed Maren something she could not immediately calculate. These were the calculations of her days. She was already cataloguing them as her palms registered the cold stone, as her knees took the impact, as she gathered herself to rise. 2 of the Veldrath guard were laughing. She could hear them without looking. She did not look. A shadow crossed the ground in front of her. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. Stop. Cut off. The way sound cuts, when something of sufficient weight enters a space and the air rearranges itself around the intrusion. Elara looked up. There was a hand in her field of vision, large. The knuckles were chapped from cold riding, and a scar ran diagonally across the back of it from index finger to wrist. An old scar, long since silver, the kind that comes from a blade and reminds you it was there every winter morning. The hand was extended, palm up. She followed it up past the wrist, the forearm, the bulk of a shoulder that filled a road-dusted traveling cloak the way certain men fill rooms, not loudly, but completely, up to a face. The first thing she registered was stillness, not the stillness of a man waiting. That kind of stillness has tension woven through it, a coiled quality, impatience dressed in patience's clothes. This was something else, the stillness of someone for whom movement was a deliberate choice rather than a default. His face was angular, jaw set in clean lines that the cold had sharpened further. His hair was ink dark against the pale winter sky, and his eyes— dark grey, she thought at first. Then the light shifted, and they were closer to charcoal, to the color of iron that has been worked until it knows what fire is. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, because it contained nothing she was accustomed to receiving. No contempt, no pity, no careful assessment of her rank. He was simply looking at her, as though she were a person, as though that were obvious. Elara looked at his hand. Then she looked back at his face. Then she planted her own right palm against the frozen stone and rose. She did it smoothly, collecting herself the way she had learned to collect herself, without drama, without performance, with the economy of someone who has fallen before and knows the choreography of returning to standing. She did not touch his hand. Something shifted in his expression. Barely. A fractional thing. A movement of the muscles around his eyes that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. "Self-possession," he said. His voice was low, not unkind. The words were for her alone. They did not carry. "Good, Lion." Then he was moving past her and into the castle, the cloak shifting behind him, and the two guards had found something intensely interesting to examine on the far side of the courtyard. Elara stood in the middle of the flagstones, surrounded by scattered clean linen. Her heart was doing something irregular. She was aware of it in the clinical way she had become aware of all her body's communications, noting the data without immediately interpreting it. She reached down and began gathering the linen, methodical piece by piece, her right hand leading. At the castle gate, she heard a pause in footsteps. Not long, a single breath's worth, perhaps less. She did not look up, but she was aware, with some instinct older than reason, that he had stopped walking. Then the footsteps resumed, into the dark of the arched entry, and he was gone. The morning air smelled, faintly, of pine resin and cold iron, and something else she could not name, something warm and dark that had no business in this frozen courtyard. It faded before she could hold it. She gathered the last of the linen and continued across the yard. 703, she thought, and counting. The great hall of Veldrath was lit by 100 candles the night the king dined at Casimir's table. Elara moved through the edges of the room, the way she moved through most spaces these days, efficiently, at the correct angle, with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned that visibility carries a price she is rarely able to pay. She carried the wine. She refilled without being asked. She kept her eyes on the task in front of her, and not on the man at the head of the table who was, she was aware, the same man from the courtyard. He was seated at Casimir's right, which said everything about the political calculus of the evening. In the candlelight, he looked different and not different. The same stillness, the same contained quality, but she could see it better now, the way it was not coldness exactly, but something more like density. He was listening to Casimir describe the southern boundary disputes, with the expression of a man whose mind is operating on a separate problem entirely. His eyes moved across the room in slow, deliberate intervals. She noticed this because she was very good at noticing eyes that move. She was poring for the third seat from the left when it happened. She had watched Isolde all evening. She had learned long ago to track Isolde the way you track weather, not from fear of a single moment, but from the understanding that conditions accumulate, and the accumulation matters. So when Isolde shifted her weight, when the chair leg caught the stone just so, Elara had already half-turned, already begun to adjust. Not fast enough. The wine went wide. She felt the jug tip, felt her grip compensate a fraction too late, felt the cold liquid arc through the air between her and Isolde's white gown, and then there was nothing to be done. It was physics. It was done. The room did not go quiet. The room had never been quite quiet. 30 people at dinner is never quiet. But there was a particular quality to the attention that shifted toward Elara in the seconds that followed. The kind of attention that is its own species of silence. Isolde set down her own cup with the delicacy of someone who is choosing their movements very deliberately. She did not look at the wine. She looked at Elara. "Fetch the guard," she said pleasantly, to no one in particular and everyone at once. 20 stripes. She's ruined lace that took 3 months to make. The pleasantness was the worst part. Elara had known this for years, that Isolde's voice never changed register when she caused harm, the same way a knife blade is the same temperature whether idle or in use. Elara closed her eyes. She brought her hands to her sides and pressed them flat against her thighs. Right palm against the rough wool of her skirt, left palm against the other side, feeling the familiar texture anchor her. Her jaw tightened. She had done this before, not the exact shape of this moment, but the shape of bracing, of making the body into something smaller and harder and prepare. She had become very good at prepare. The guard was moving. She heard his footsteps. Then she heard a chair. The sound of a chair pushed back at a table of 30 people has a particular quality depending on who is pushing it. This one had weight to it, not theatrical weight, not the sound of temper or performance. It was simply the sound of someone standing up who, when he stood, changed the geometry of the room. She opened her eyes. Kael Stormveil, King of 4 territories, commander of the Northern Alliance. The man who had stood in this courtyard 3 hours ago and said good in a voice that carried no obligation, stood between her and the guard. He had not said anything. He was not saying anything now. He was simply occupying the space, and occupying it with the particular totality of a person who has never, in his adult life, needed to explain why he stands where he stands. The guard had stopped. He was looking at a point somewhere near Kael's left ear, which was the safest available option. The room held its breath. Isolde's pleasant expression had not changed, but her hands, Elara noticed, were still on the table. After a moment, long enough to be an answer, not so long as to be a spectacle, Kael turned his head a fraction and looked at Elara. "Come," he said quietly. Not a command. The word had a different architecture than a command, softer at the edges, the kind of word that leaves space for an answer. Elara looked at him. Her pulse was doing something complicated, and she catalogued it and set it aside. "Where?" she asked. "Somewhere with fewer witnesses," he said. Then, even more quietly, "somewhere you can breathe." The room they found was a storeroom at the end of the east corridor, not elegant, but private, with a single rushlight that Brennan had produced from somewhere, with the efficient economy of a man accustomed to solving practical problems in unfamiliar castles. Brennan himself was the king's lieutenant and closest advisor, a broad-shouldered man with a navigator's habit of assessing every room he entered for its exits. He set the rushlight on a barrel and withdrew to the corridor without being asked. Kael closed the door. The room contracted. Then, not literally, it was the same handful of square feet it had been a moment ago, the same stone walls, the same smell of dried lavender and dusty wool. But Elara had spent years in spaces that felt larger, because other people's authority had vacated them, and this was the opposite. The room adjusted itself around this man's presence the way a room adjusts around a fire, everything oriented toward a new source of heat. She stood near the wall. He sat in the chair, the only chair, an old wooden thing that had probably outlived 3 generations of Veldrath stewards. He had taken off his riding gloves. They were tucked in his belt now. His bare hands rested on his knees, unhurried. "Your right wrist," he said. His eyes moved to where she was holding it, slightly back, slightly guarded. He had noticed that then. He noticed things. She hesitated. Then she held it out. The right one. The one that had taken the impact of the jug when she tried to compensate for the spill. The swelling was mild. Nothing broken. Nothing that would not fade in a week. He took her wrist in both his hands. His touch was precise. The hands of someone who had done this before, who had learned to be careful with damaged things, not from tenderness alone, but from the practical knowledge that careless handling makes things worse. She felt the warmth of his palms even through the careful, clinical grip. He reached for the cloth strips in the small kit at his belt and began to wrap. Silence filled the room between them. Not comfortable silence. The silence of two people who have not yet located the register in which they might speak, who are circling that question while doing other things. She watched his hands. They were the hands of someone who had fought. She could read it in the calluses, in the particular topography of healed abrasions across the knuckles, but they moved on the cloth with a care that seemed to come from an entirely separate part of his experience. Some other set of years that had taught him that gentleness and strength were not opposed. "Why didn't you call out?" he asked. He was looking at the bandage. His voice carried no judgment. It was a straightforward inquiry, the kind you ask when you actually want to know. No one would have come. She looked at the wall. Or if they had, it would have made things worse. He wrapped another layer. His hands did not pause, but she felt the quality of his attention shift. A slight, subtle adjustment, the way water changes surface texture before the wind hits it. "How long?" he asked. She had been asked this before, in various forms, by various people. "How long have you been serving here? How long since your demotion? How long has this been your life?" The question was always really asking, "How much should I pity you?" She had grown to dislike it. But his voice held no pity. It held only the question. 703 days, she said. He stopped rapping. Not for long. A few seconds, perhaps, long enough that she noticed it, long enough that the silence had a shape. Then he finished, tied the end with the same economical efficiency, and the task was complete. He did not release her wrist immediately. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that could be attributed to nothing, an oversight, a momentary lapse in the transition between completing one motion and beginning the next. His hands remained around her wrist for perhaps 3 heartbeats longer than necessary. She counted them. She was a person who counted things. Then he let go. He stood. He was very tall in the low-ceilinged space, the rushlight casting his shadow large against the far wall. He turned toward the door. His back was to her. "Your name," he said. "Elara." A pause. "Elara van Ashford, Toon." He went still. It was different from his usual stillness. That was the stillness of a man in command of himself. This was something else, a stillness that came from outside him, imposed the way a sudden frost stops water mid-motion. He did not turn around immediately. His hand was near the door. Then, slowly, he turned. In the rushlight, his eyes had shifted. The dark gray of them was deeper now, or perhaps it was only the quality of light in a small room that made them look that way, like the color of deep water in shadow. "Aldrich van Ashford's daughter," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." The word landed in the space between them and settled there. He looked at her the way she had occasionally seen scholars look at a manuscript whose provenance they had been uncertain of and have just confirmed with a reckoning, a recalibration of something previously assumed. I served under him, he said, and something in his voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate, the way a man speaks when he is being careful with something fragile. 3 years before the throne, he was a pause, and she had the impression he was selecting among several true things. He was the only commander I served under who looked at me before he looked at my rank. Most people, when they learn what you are, see the rank first. He never did. He was like that, she said. Something moved in her chest. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something adjacent to it. The specific ache of recognizing a person accurately after they can no longer confirm the recognition. He saw people. Yes. A beat? He would have been furious. She met his eyes. Yes, she said. He would have. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than most moments in her recent memory. I will have someone at your door tonight, he said finally. Don't go anywhere. I have nowhere to go, she said. You do now, he said. And then he was gone, and she was standing in the small room with her wrapped wrist, and the rushlight, and the smell of lavender, and the very recent memory of hands that had been careful with her wrist, and a voice that had said you do now, as though it were already decided. She pressed her wrapped wrist against her side, and stood there for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the feast continuing without her. The room they brought her to was the finest in the guest wing. Elara stood in the center of it and looked around. A proper hearth, with an actual fire in it, not the banked coals she had been rationing through 3 winters. Wall hangings in deep blue and gray, thick enough to actually stop the draft that came through Veldrath stones in January day. A bed with 3 blankets. 3 towel. She counted them. Zabeel appeared in the doorway, a young woman with quick, capable hands and the practical cheerfulness of someone who has learned that efficiency is its own form of kindness. She had been in service to the crown for 4 years, long enough to move through the room with the ease of someone setting order in a familiar space. She brought fresh clothing, warm water, and a discretion that asked no questions Elara had not offered answers to. Footsteps behind her. She turned. He had come in quietly. She had not heard him until he was already inside, which said something about how he moved in spaces he occupied. He had removed a traveling cloak. Underneath it, he wore dark linen and leather, simple for a king, and she understood without needing it, explained that simplicity was a choice rather than a lack. You're not afraid, he observed. Should I be? Most people brought to this room are. He said it as a fact, nothing inflected. She considered the room again. The fire. The blankets. This is the warmest space I've occupied in 3 years, she said. Whatever happens in the morning, tonight I'm sleeping somewhere that doesn't seep frost through the walls. That's difficult to be afraid of. A pause, longer than the ones before it. She watched something move across his expression, not quite surprise, more like the adjustment a person makes when the ground turns out to be different than the map described. Sit down, he said. Then, as if hearing himself, if you'd like to. She sat. When she came back to the main room, washed and changed, and wrapped in someone else's warm robe with her hair wet against the back of her neck, he was sitting at the far side of the fire, not reading, not working, simply sitting there, forearms resting on his knees, looking into the flames with an expression she could not immediately name, not vacant, never vacant, but directed inward towards some problem he was working through in the architecture of his own thought. He looked, in that moment, less like a king than like a man who carries something heavy and has gotten good enough at it that people forget he is carrying anything at all. She sat down at the other side of the hearth. The fire moved between them, warm and ordinary, performing its ancient function of giving people a third thing to look at when looking at each other becomes too direct. She was grateful for it. She had not realized until sitting in this chair in this warmth how cold she had been. Not just tonight, not just this winter, but in the accumulated way, the way that settles so gradually into a person's bones that they stop registering it as cold and begin registering it simply as the nature of things. "You knew my father," she said. It was not a question. She had heard it in his voice when she'd given her name. He looked up from the fire. "I served under him for 3 years before I came to the throne. He was." A pause, and she had the impression he was selecting among several true things. "He was the only commander I served under who looked at me before he looked at my rank. Most people, when they learn what you are, see that first. He never did." "He was like that," she said. "He saw people." "Yes." The fire settled. A log shifted, sent sparks up the chimney, subsided. The silence between them was not the taut silence of strangers who have nothing to say. It was the quieter kind, the silence of two people who have said enough for now, and are resting in the space that creates. Then, eventually, "Why did you intervene at the feast?" She looked at the fire rather than at him. "No one required you to." He was quiet for a moment. "Because I couldn't not," he said. She did look at him then. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "But it's the only honest one I have tonight." She held his gaze for a beat, 2 beats. There was something disarming about his directness. She had grown accustomed to people who said things obliquely, who communicated through implication and omission. He simply said things. She was not entirely sure what to do with someone who simply said things. "Tomorrow," he said, shifting, "I intend to bring you before the council, as a witness to certain—" "You didn't ask me," she said. He stopped. "Whether I wanted to be brought before anyone, whether I wanted to be used as a piece in a political arrangement, even an arrangement that might benefit me." The fire moved between them. His expression had not changed, but she had the impression of something adjusting, a recalculation, the particular quality of a person who has just been shown a variable they had omitted. "What do you want?" he asked. The question was genuine. She had spent 3 years living in a house where no one asked her what she wanted, and the genuine quality of the question was almost as disorienting as everything else about this evening. "I want to speak with Dorian," she said, "before any council, alone." "That's not." "You asked what I want," I answered. "If you don't intend to listen, don't ask." The fire snapped. In the silence following it, she was aware of how still the room was, and how still he was inside it, and how much of the air between them was occupied by something that neither of them had said. "Tomorrow morning," he said finally. "Brennan stands outside the door. 17 minutes. She had offered 20. He had counted 15. They had arrived, without any formal acknowledgement that this was what they were doing, at 17. The corner of her mouth shifted, barely. "All right." "All right," he said. Neither of them moved toward the door. Outside, Veldrath slept its winter sleep, snow beginning again in the dark beyond the tapestried windows, and the fire kept burning, and neither of them seemed in any particular hurry to end the evening. The practice room was small and smelled of sawdust and old steel. Elara arrived first and stood in the center of it, facing the door, and waited. The door opened. Dorian stepped in. He had always been well made, in the way of men whose appearance has been maintained rather than earned. The jaw, the coloring, the studied ease of posture. She had once found him beautiful. She was not certain she could remember what that had felt like. She looked at him now, and found only the familiar and the legible. the calculation in the eyes, the slight tension in the shoulders that meant he had been rehearsing something and was worried it would not hold. "Elara," he began. "I'm not here to convict you," she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided, somewhere in the small hours before dawn, that she was done carrying the weight of his guilt alongside her own. "I don't want an apology, and I don't want an explanation. I want one true thing. Why?" He closed his mouth, opened it, closed it again. This was the version of Dorian she had rarely seen, stripped of the performance, the architecture of authority and ease that he wore so carefully. Beneath it, he was younger than she remembered, smaller. "Because I was afraid of you," he said. The words arrived quietly, as though they had been compressed into a small space for a long time and had very little force left in them by the time they came out. "From the beginning, before I knew why, there was something in you I couldn't control it, couldn't predict it, couldn't contain it, and I couldn't—" He stopped, started over. "I couldn't be an alpha beside someone who might be stronger, even if that strength was only the kind that comes from knowing who you are." He looked at his hands. "I told myself you had no wolf. I told myself long enough that I believed it. It was easier than the truth." He didn't just leave her. Elara stood very still, understanding the full shape of it for the first time. Not just the abandonment, but the story he had needed to construct around it, the slow, deliberate erasure that had turned her into something he could afford to discard. He spent 703 days building a world where what he did made sense. She looked at him. She waited to feel something sharp, triumph, or grief, or the vindication she had perhaps imagined this moment would carry. What she felt instead was something quieter, and in its way more final. Understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever. But the comprehension of a shape, a thing seen clearly at last. "Thank you," she said. "That's what I needed to know." "Elara." "It's enough, Dorian." She turned toward the door. She did not know until she opened it that Kael was in the corridor. He was standing a few feet back from the frame, neither ostentatiously near nor pretending to be elsewhere. Brennan was beside him, looking at a point on the wall with the focused interest of a man who is pretending with great commitment to have heard nothing. "You listened," she said. "I came to walk you back." His voice carried no particular inflection. Brennan took an early shift. She looked at him. "You listened." "A beat." "Yes." She considered him in the low light of the corridor, the frost-gray stone behind him, the torchlight making something warmer of the lines of his face than daylight did, the careful way he was standing, which was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of a man waiting for a verdict. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He met her eyes without armor. She had noticed this about him, the absence of the defensive architecture that most people maintained in their expressions, the habit of looking without shields. "That Dorian is the worst kind of coward," he said. "The kind who knows exactly what he's doing." A pause, and his voice dropped a register. "And that you are the strongest person I have encountered in some years, because you made what he gave you into something you understood, rather than something you kept in order to use against him." The corridor held the silence between them like cupped water. She did not say anything. She did not need to. But when she began walking toward the great hall, she did not walk ahead of him. They moved through the corridor side by side, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was nothing like the silences she was accustomed to. The hallway to the great council chamber was narrow, and Casimir was waiting in it. He had positioned himself carefully, the angle of the torchlight, the way he stood, arms loose at his sides, the posture of a man who wants to communicate harmlessness. Elara had met enough dangerous people by now to recognize how hard they worked to look safe. Elara. His voice was almost fatherly. Almost. A word, before we go in. She stopped. She did not look for Kael. She knew without looking that the corridor bent behind her, that voices carried in stone. I know what was done, Casimir said. His voice had lowered, the fatherly quality straining at its own seams. I cannot undo it. But if you'll consent to set aside certain matters, in the council, I can promise you freedom, means, safe passage to wherever you choose. She looked at him. He was not, she thought, a cruel man. Cruelty requires a kind of investment. Cruelty has conviction. He was something worse and more common. A man who had stood at the fork of the right thing and the easy thing and had not found the right thing interesting enough to risk for. He had been at the Eastern Marches. He had stood beside her father. He had chosen, in the end, the path that cost him nothing, and had watched what it cost someone else across 703 days without once finding the cost unbearable enough to act. Lord Casimir, she said, were you at the Eastern Marches when my father fell? He blinked. Yes, I was. Do you remember what you said to him before the last engagement? His mouth moved, but nothing came. He told me, she said, word for word, the way he told me everything that mattered. Aldrich, behind you stands everything worth fighting for. He believed you meant it. She looked at him steadily. You did not deserve that, and I will not purchase my safety by proving that you did. She walked past him. At the far end of the corridor, just at the bend, she heard nothing that indicated anyone had been there. But when she stepped into the torchlight of the council antechamber, Kael was already beside her, and his jaw was set in the particular way of a man whose opinion of someone has just been permanently revived. The council chamber smelled of beeswax and old wood, and the specific tension of 12 men who have been asked to make a decision they would prefer not to make. Elara walked in beside Kael, not behind him, not ahead, beside which was a declaration of its own in a room full of people who understood spatial politics, and she felt the attention of the room land on her like a change in air pressure. Lord Edric Stonehaven sat at the far end of the table. He was not a sentimental man. Everyone in the room knew it. He had the face of the northern winter, the kind that has seen enough to have stopped being surprised by anything. When she entered, his eyes moved to her and stayed there, with the particular quality of someone checking a recognition they had not expected to need to make. Dorian was already seated. He looked at her, and then away. Isolde sat beside him, directly beside him, in a position of adjacency that was, as Lord Edric noted within 3 minutes, a violation of the council's convening protocol. He noted it dryly, precisely, and let the irony settle into the room without further comment. The proceedings unrolled the way proceedings do, formal, procedural, with the pacing of water-wearing stone. Dorian raised objections, carefully worded, legally framed, the objections of someone who has prepared and is hoping preparation will be enough. He cited precedent. He cited the Compact of Eisenwald, the 800-year foundation of werewolf law, and its provisions on fated bond dissolution. He was very good at citing things. Elara watched him and thought, this is what preparation looks like when it is doing work it was never meant to do, the way old armor gets fitted over a wrong body, and looks correct from a distance, and gives way at the seams when the pressure finally arrives. Casimir invoked the Compact's requirement for specific evidence of harm to a pack member before the council's jurisdiction could be triggered. He read the relevant passage in a voice that was perfectly steady and perfectly hollow. The voice of a man who has rehearsed composure until composure is all that is left. Kael said we have specific evidence of harm. He said it the way he said most things, Without drama, without emphasis, the way you state a fact that does not require the performance of certainty, because certainty is already present in the structure of the sentence. He let it stand. The room considered it. Then Brennan produced the documents. Trade records. Financial correspondence between the House of Varn and the household accounts of Veldrath. The careful paper trail of an arrangement that was not, on its face, illegal, and was, in its implications, deeply and specifically damning. Brennan set them down one by one with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been preparing this particular argument for longer than the council knew. The documents had been assembled before the king's party had even ridden through Veldrath's gates, gathered by the crown's own correspondence over months of careful inquiry. Elara watched Isolde's face as the documents were read aloud. Isolde was very good. She remained composed through the first page, and the second, and the third. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, her left hand holding the pen she had been using to make notes, a detail Elara marked and filed. She was calculating. Elara could see it in the small movements around her eyes. The rapid assessment, the search for exits, the construction of a counter-argument. Then came the claim about Elara's wolf. Dorian offered it near the end, in the voice of a man who has saved his best card and is now playing it. That she carried no wolf, that the bond's dissolution had been valid and complete, that she was not, and had never truly been packed. She felt the room shift when he said it, the way certain words move collective attention like wind moves grass, all in one direction. She felt the moment poised, pregnant, waiting. She stood up. The scrape of the chair against stone was very loud in the held breath of the room. She felt 30 sets of eyes recalibrate toward her, the weight of them, the categorizing quality of collective attention, that specific pressure of being seen after years of having worked very hard not to be. She straightened her spine the way her father had taught her. Not performatively, not in defiance, simply correctly, the way a person stands when they have decided that the standing matters. Later, she would not be able to say exactly what happened in the seconds that followed. She knew that something in her changed register, that the thing she had spent 3 years keeping carefully banked, carefully contained, carefully untended, chose this particular moment to remember itself. She felt it in her spine first, then her hands, then everywhere. Her eyes changed. She could feel it, a brightness behind the gray, silver moving through it. The wolf she had been told was absent, announcing itself with something like irritation at having been so long denied. He told himself you had no wolf, she thought, remembering Dorian's voice in the practice room. He told himself long enough that he believed it. A hand touched her shoulder. Not restraining, not possessive. Kael's hand, placed there with a precision that communicated one thing only. I'm here. The warmth of it moved through the layers of cloth between his palm and her skin. Her wolf, present, undeniable, apparently with opinions, recognized the warmth, leaned toward it, infinitesimally, the way a needle finds north. She spoke. She did not plan what she said. It came from the place inside her that was done with planning, done with careful calculation and strategic silence. She talked about what it was to count 703 days. She talked about her father and what he had died for, and what his daughter had been made into in the house of his supposed allies. She talked about the kind of harm that does not always leave marks that a council can inspect, the kind that lives instead in a person's body, in the particular knowledge of how long it takes to become invisible enough to survive, in the weight of a name she had kept private and exact when everything else had been taken. She had kept private and exact when everything else had been taken. She talked about the rope through her right palm at the well each morning, and Merrin's bread, and the counting. She was still speaking when Lord Edric Stonehaven got to his feet. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, I fought beside Aldrich van Ashford at the Eastern Marches. I know his way of standing, his way of holding ground when the ground is back. He paused. I recognized her before she said her name. He was the first to stand. He was not the last. The chamber had rearranged itself. The mood of it, the weight distribution, the center of gravity. And it was then that Isolde stood up. She had waited for the room to settle, which was itself a kind of intelligence. She reached into the small document case beside her and produced a folded paper. A letter, she said. Her voice had not changed. It was still pleasant, still smooth. Written by Elara van Ashford herself, to my father's house, requesting assistance in severing her bond with Lord Dorian. She sought this arrangement of her own volition. The entire matter was at her instigation. The room went to pieces in the quiet way rooms go to pieces. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, simply the sound of 12 men reconsidering what they thought they knew. Kay looked at Elara. He said nothing. He waited. She looked at the letter that Isolde had placed on the table. She reached out and took it with her right hand, the one with the callus from the well rope, the one that had pressed against frozen stone that morning in the courtyard. She read it slowly, with the attention she gave to everything she was reading for the last time. Then she turned it over once, set it down, and looked at Isolde. I write with my right hand, she said. Her voice was conversational, unhurried. I always have. My father noticed it when I was 4 years old and thought I was favoring the left. But I wasn't. The left was just the one that reached for things first, out of curiosity. Right hand writes. The pen angle is different, the pressure distribution along the downstroke. She tapped the letter with her right index finger. This was written by someone left-handed. You can see it in the lean of the letters, the way the ink thickens on the upstroke instead of the down. She looked at Isolde. Do you write with your right hand or your left? Isolde's expression did not change, but her hands, still visible on the table, her left hand holding the pen she had been using to make notes throughout the proceedings, were perfectly still. The room looked at the pen. The room looked at Isolde. Dorian looked at Isolde. And Elara watched Dorian's face in the moment he understood. Not just the letter, not just this particular deception, but the architecture beneath it, the shape of how long it had been there, the revelation that he had been standing inside a construction someone else had built and had believed, genuinely and completely, that the walls around him were his own. He did not speak. He looked at his hands, which were on the table, and he kept looking at them. And his face was the face of someone who has just understood the dimensions of a room they cannot now leave. That will be enough, Kael said. He was not speaking to Isolde. He was speaking to the room, to the moment, ending it cleanly the way he ended things, with precision, without flourish. Before the judgment, Kael found her in the anteroom. He came in quietly, as he always did, and stopped a few feet away and spoke close to her ear so only she could hear. You don't have to do this now. If you need more time. I've been waiting 703 days. She turned her head just enough to look at him. He was very close enough that she could see the scar on his jaw in detail, the faint asymmetry of it, the way it had healed slightly raised. Close enough that whatever it was that moved between them when they were in proximity to each other was audible if you were paying the right kind of attention. I'm ready. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back. One step, deliberate, clearing the space in front of her, and the gesture said everything he had not said aloud. This is yours. I will not stand in front of it. She walked into the chamber. She spoke to Dorian first. She had thought about this moment many times across 703 days. In the early months, she had imagined it as a reckoning, loud, righteous, the kind of scene that lives at the end of the stories she had been told as a child. the vindication that reshapes the world into the shape it should always have had. Later, she had stopped imagining it as anything. There was too much else to do. The imagining was a luxury for people who had surplus hours, and she had not had surplus hours. Standing here now, she found she had no interest in reckoning. She was tired of carrying things, and making a scene of Dorian's destruction would only require her to carry it further. "You are a coward," she said. "But you told me the truth when I asked for it. I won't destroy you for what you are." She paused. "I'll let you live inside it." She spoke to his old neck. "Your ambition is not what you're being sentenced for. Ambition is neutral. It depends entirely on what you're willing to do with it." She looked at his old steadily, at the composed face and the flat hands and the pleasant expression that had not cracked through any of it, not even at the end. "You used someone else's life as currency. That is what you're being sentenced for." The accounting that followed was precise, without drama. Dorian stripped of his succession, confined to Veldrath under Brennan's oversight. Isolde's holdings assessed, the corresponding value redirected to establish the first training and support institution for Omegas in the Alliance. Her name attached to it permanently, not as a legacy, but as a bill come due. Casimir. Abdication. A long quiet retirement. The particular punishment of a man who will have years to understand exactly what his caution cost. Lord Edric was the first to bow his head. Kael waited until the room had settled, until the sentence had become reality rather than proclamation. Then, "The Luna's judgment is my judgment," he said. And that was all. Zibil moved around Elara with practiced efficiency, the formal gown laid out, the hair being sectioned with quick, sure hands, and she talked the way water moves, around and over and through, without seeming to notice any obstacles. "The first time I met him, he was mending his own cloak," she said. "In the corner of the war tent, with a needle borrowed from the supply sergeant, because he didn't want to ask anyone to do it for him." She paused, securing a section of hair. The king of 4 territories, mending a cloak at midnight, so no one would have to be troubled. Elara watched her own reflection in the bronze mirror. Her hair, unbound, was longer than she had realized. It had been a long time since anyone had done anything with it other than pin it up out of the way. "Is he ever afraid?" she asked. Zibil's hands stilled briefly. It was a brief stillness, the kind that comes before a true answer rather than a quick one. "Always," she said. "He's afraid of every decision, every day, afraid of the ones he gets wrong." A pause, something more careful in it. "He's just very practiced at making them anyway." Elara looked at her reflection. "Why do you ask?" "Because this morning, before I went into the chamber, he said I didn't have to. He asked if I was ready." She watched her own eyes in the mirror. Grey, storm grey, the same eyes that had looked up from a courtyard floor and found something unexpected. "That's the first time in 3 years anyone asked whether I was ready before asking something of me." Zibil's hands resumed. She did not say anything for a moment, but her mouth, in the corner of the mirror, was doing something that might have been a smile. He found her on the balcony. She had not intended to be found. She had simply needed air, the particular cold clarity of winter air after the density of the hall, and had followed the corridor to where it opened onto the narrow stone balcony above the river. The Moravia lay below, dark and ice-edged, moving slowly under a skin of grey that might have been water and might have been sky. The horizon had disappeared in the afternoon snowfall, everything blurred into a single pale expanse. She heard his footsteps and did not turn. He came to stand beside her. Not close, a forearm's length, the careful spacing of someone who understands that proximity is a statement and is considering the grammar of it. The cold came off the balcony rail in waves. She was aware of him the way she was aware of fire in the same room, not looking directly, but knowing exactly where the warmth was coming from. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "My father would have liked this view." She kept her eyes on the river. He liked water, said it was the only thing that had the sense to keep moving. Beside her, he was quiet for a moment. "I've never met anyone who counted days," he said. "You've never lost everything in a single night." "No. Betrayal." The word came out smaller than his voice usually was, stripped of its usual careful weight. She glanced at him, sideways, and found him looking at the river, too, his profile cut clean against the pale sky. There was something in the single syllable that was honest in the way very few things were, an admission that sat beside hers, rather than above or below it. The space between them was an arm's length. Then it was slightly less. She could not have said which of them moved. Perhaps neither. Perhaps it was only the cold, and the rail and the logic of two warm bodies in a winter space, the subtle physics of presence that has no name. His hand came down on the balcony rail, beside hers, not on top of it, not around it. The back of his hand against the back of hers, bare skin against bare skin, the contact so slight that it would have registered as nothing to anyone watching. It registered as nothing, and it registered as everything. The cold of the rail was between them, and the warmth of the contact was also between them, and she was very aware of both simultaneously. She did not move her hand. He did not move his. "Kael," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. It landed in the space between them, and he heard it. She knew he heard it because the pressure of his hand against hers increased barely a fraction, the way a person presses back when they are pressed. That was all. That was, somehow, sufficient. They stood in the winter and looked at the river, and the snow began again, light and indifferent, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them moved, and the distance between them was the width of two hands that were almost touching. The ceremony was held in the great hall as the candles burned toward midnight. The crown was silver, dark silver, the particular shade of metal that has been worked from old ore. When Brennan had shown her to the threshold of the hall, and she had asked quietly where the silver had come from, he had told her. The Eastern Territories, the mountains above the Ashford lands, ore that had been held in trust under the Alliance Charter for 7 years, waiting. The king's order to commission the crown had been made months earlier, before the royal party had ridden for Veldrath, before Kael had known that Elara van Ashford still lived. He had described his reason, when pressed by Brennan at the time, as a feeling he could not account for and chose not to examine too closely. He had simply known, in some wordless way, that the wolf in him had always been better at certainty than the man, that the silver was meant for something. She had stood at the threshold for a moment with that knowledge sitting in her chest, unfamiliar and weightless, like the first warm day after a long winter, when the body doesn't quite believe yet that the cold is done. Then she had walked in. Kael lifted the crown. He was looking at her, not at the crown, not at the assembled witnesses, at her, with the grey dark eyes that had watched her across a frozen courtyard, and a storeroom, and a firelit night, and a narrow corridor, that had not looked away. That had not looked away. Then something happened in his eyes. She noticed it even as she was still processing everything else, the weight of the moment, the sound of the hall, the warmth of the candle. Something changed in the color of his eyes. The dark grey shifted, moved, resolved into something that had not been there before. A deep, amber-edged gold, moving through the grey the way dawn moves through the hour before sunrise, gradual and then all at once. The bond. She felt it the same moment she saw it, a warmth that was not the candles, not the fire, not the room. It moved through her from the center outward, and she understood it without needing anyone to explain it, the way you understand your own heartbeat, the way you understand the difference between the cold you were born into and the cold you have lived through. Her wolf, the one she had been told was absent, the one she had felt move through her in the council chamber, the one that had leaned toward his warmth on the balcony, recognized it first. The rest of her followed. His eyes were gold. He spoke. He spoke without reading from anything, without looking away, without the careful distance of formal speech. He said, "I sought someone worthy of standing beside me, not through lineage, not through beauty, but through the evidence of having looked directly into the darkest part of their own life and not forgotten who they were." He looked at her. His eyes, gold now, deep amber gold that had replaced the dark grey entirely, as though the grey had only ever been winter waiting for the season that would change it, did not leave her. "My wolf," he said, in a voice that was quieter than the formal speech around it, that was only for her, that was simply and completely true. The hall rang with voices, not chaos, not the noise of spectacle, but the particular sound of a room that has reached a shared conclusion and is expressing it collectively, the way a murmuration of birds changes direction, all at once, without a signal anyone can point to. The bond settled into her like a key finding its lock, not forcing anything, not demanding anything, simply fitting, the way things fit that have always been meant for each other and have simply been waiting, on either side of the door, for someone to turn the mechanism. And Lord Edric Stonehaven bowed his head and said something to the man beside him that she could not hear across the distance. And the man beside him bowed too, and then the next, and the next. Later, much later, after the hall had emptied by degrees and the candles had burned low, and the formal structure of the evening had dissolved into its aftermath, she found herself standing at a window with his arms around her, and neither of them was speaking. His chin rested on her hair. She had her face against his chest, and she could feel the beat of his heart through the cloth and the warmth, and the wool, steady and deliberate, the same rhythm as everything else about him. Under her ear, it was constant, unhurried. Not the racing rhythm of ceremony and crisis that had filled the last 2 days, but the deep bass line of someone returned to himself, to the quiet beneath all the noise. His arms were around her shoulders, and he was not holding her tightly, only holding her, the way you hold something you have been carrying carefully for a long time, and can now simply carry. Outside, the snow had picked up. She could hear it in the quality of the silence. Winter snow has a particular sound, which is the sound of sound being absorbed, the world muffled and held, everything at one remove. Veldrath below them was dark, the river darker, the far bank invisible in white. She thought, 703 days. She thought, 703, 703, 700 and then she stopped thinking about it. Not because the number left her, or because the days had been unmade, or because anything had been erased, but because for the first time in 703 mornings, the counting felt like something that had served its purpose. It had kept her honest. It had kept her real. It had carried her from one end of a long dark corridor to an exit she could not have seen from the entrance. She did not need to count anymore. She pressed her face into his chest, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head, and the snow fell outside the window, and Veldrath was quiet, and neither of them said anything at all. The Moravia ran south to the plains below, carrying the winter's memory toward thaw. In the east, In the mountains above a territory that bore her name, the silver ore lay patient in the stone, waiting for the next generation's purposes. In the great hall below, the candles burned to their ends. Maren of Veldrath moved through the corridors with her quiet step and her dark skirts, extinguishing each one. In the morning, there would be decisions about Veldrath, about the Alliance, about the road east toward a landscape she had not seen since childhood. She would stand at another window in the early grey light, and he would find her there as he had found her the evening before, and he would say, quietly, without ceremony, without it being anything other than what it was, "When you're ready to go home." And she would say, "Soon." And that would be true. There would be councils and logistics, and the particular labor of rebuilding things that had been broken deliberately over years. There would be days she did not know how to be anything other than what 703 mornings had made her, and days she surprised herself by knowing exactly who she was. There would be mornings at other windows, with other views, in which she would reach for the counting out of old habit and find she had already let it go. But that was morning. For now there was only this, a window and winter, and two people who had not yet learned to take each other for granted, which is the only time anyone is fully awake to what they have. The silver crown was forged 3 months before the king's arrival at Veldrath, from Ashford holdings held in trust under the Alliance Charter since the death of Lord Aldrich. The king's order to commission it was made without a specific recipient in mind, a decision he would describe, if pressed, as a feeling he could not account for, and chose not to examine too closely until it became clear what it was for. Brennan had recorded the order in the expedition ledger under miscellaneous ceremonial commissions, and had not asked questions, because he had served Kael Stormveil for 11 years, and had learned to recognize the difference between decisions the king would later be able to explain and decisions that would explain themselves. Maren of Veldrath was confirmed as Lady Warden and founding director of the Ashford Varn Recovery Foundation, the name chosen by Lord Kael over Isolde's considerable objection, which was not a consideration that survived long in a room where Kael had already made up his mind, in the spring following. She accepted the appointment without ceremony, asked only that her title carry no obligation to attend formal dinners, and returned the same morning to her work. She was, in the years that followed, regarded as one of the most effective administrators in the Northern Territories, though she would not have used the word effective, and would have found the label mildly embarrassing. Dorian Veldrath spent many years on the Tower Walk above the Moravia, watching the river. He was not unhappy, exactly. He was honest, which was harder, and perhaps more important, than happiness. Brennan was made Lord Commander of the King's Personal Guard the following year, a promotion he received with the same expression he brought to most things, the look of a man who had already assumed the responsibility and was simply now receiving the title to match. The count was 703 days. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the end, exactly as many as it needed to be.